15th BRICS Summit wrapped up in Kazan in Russia yesterday with important items topping the agenda. So Lwazi Mbuyiseli, senior researcher at the Southern African Liaison Office, is going to be weighing in further this morning. Lwazi, good morning. Thank you for your time in the SABC at this hour.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me.
But perhaps, this being the largest gathering of world leaders in Russia in decades, looking at who attended, what topped the agenda as well, and the dynamics unfolding geopolitically, how would you assess the success of what transpired over these past few days?
On all accounts, the BRICS Summit was ultimately a success for different reasons. For Russia and for President Putin, it was to prove that Russia is no longer isolated in the eyes of the international community. Hence, you saw a number of state actors and the heads of state coming to the BRICS Summit, along with NATO allied countries such as Turkey, which participated in this BRICS Summit. Also, for other countries such as China and India, the sidelines of the BRICS Summit were an opportunity for them to deliberate on issues of high tension. For example, the Himalayan tensions that have been brewing concerning the Himalayan border between India and China resulted in some form of cease agreement between China and India. On another level, reforms around international financial institutions, and especially creating parallel institutions such as the International Institution financial reforms, along with the creation of institutions that are resulting in the individual country currency exchanges. That was very critical in not only dealing with this idea of unilateral sanctions that not only BRICS member states were complaining about, but also African member states, as they regarded as unilateral coercive measures that are not in line with the spirit of the Charter. But Russia didn't have it all on its own in terms of the outcomes of the summit, where the summit itself engaged on the Ukraine situation, calling for broader dialogue amongst the warring parties, including touching on Israel's current genocide on occupied Palestine, along with its now incursion into southern Lebanon. So, in all terms of purposes, the BRICS Summit was very successful. However, we saw now a new push towards more peace and security issues, along with reaffirmation of the current international system.
Lwazi, thank you for outlining that. I know you've said a lot, perhaps also challenging the dependence on the US dollar, as well as SWIFT system at large. The attendance of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and what that was indicative of, particularly because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict that's also occurring. But I think also just BRICS itself, or BRICS plus 6, perhaps also having invited other members, to be part of this, how they aim to counterbalance the current world order and changing economic order of sorts as well. I mean, what do these timelines look like in reality? How effective do you think they are going to be at large?
So, as we've seen from South Africa's hosting of BRICS, a lot of these discussions stemmed from previous BRICS summits. But what we've seen in this BRICS summit itself is the materialization and the consolidation of those ideas that are now manifested along with the resolution of the current BRICS summit. For example, when we talked about issues around currencies, there has been a large push, especially from the global south, to have country currencies rather than utilization of the US dollar alone as a means of exchange and trade amongst country actors. However, it does not mean that the US dollar is going to be completely abandoned by the BRICS member nations as they utilize it. There are other means of utilizing the US dollar, but we now see the greater use of national currencies to resolve debts and other trade matters. There are also other aspects such as the BRICS grain exchange, which is designed to establish a grain commodities trading platform, which is also an outcome of the current Russia-Ukraine conflict, especially concerning the issue of global grain supplies. And they're also at the creation of a BRICS cross-border payment system itself as a means of or undercutting the current SWIFT payment system itself is also a means of buffering against unilateral sanctions, as has been seen through the US imposed sanctions against Russia and a number of other countries. So in essence, what has happened within this BRICS summit was not only the consolidation of previous agenda items, but also a reflection of how do we now plug into other multilateral forums, such as the G20, and how do we now seek to have reforms manifested through those forums. For example, South Africa next year will be hosting the G20 summit, and they were looking to plugging in some of the BRICS resolutions, especially around international financial institution reform, along with other issues of how do we reform the multilateral engagements, including the UN organs and institutions, especially the UN Security Council. So all these aspects around BRICS themselves have elements of plugging into other international fora. But for the African continent itself, the inclusions of countries such as Algeria, Nigeria, and Uganda as BRICS partners, not necessarily full members, also indicates that there is a push for a greater African voice within multilateral settings, and therefore, how do these African countries now plug in the reforms and recommendations that are placated within the BRICS setup, along with other multilateral forums, into how we now develop and advance the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and Agenda 2063. That will be very critical for African state actors to translate that into domestic and continental bodies.
No, absolutely. So with inclusion of more African countries, perhaps also to your earlier point about the summit, demonstrating that Russia isn't isolated. It's got important partners like China and India, other emerging powers at large. Perhaps we could just look at, its contribution and what it represents, because it now represents about 45% of the world's population, 25% of the global domestic GDP at large. And so when you look at consolidating that power, what is next for BRICS? I know that they've now thrown their weight behind South Africa's genocide case against Israel, amongst other things. So geopolitically, talk to us about that change of guard as well.
So the current Russia summit itself, in essence, presents as a slight shift towards what BRICS historically was deliberating about in issues around finance, economies. But what we saw in this BRICS summit, issues around peace and security and human rights were very central, including Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas giving a speech at the BRICS summit. The mere notion that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres arrived at the BRICS summit to deliberate with emerging country actors was a very critical and also legitimized the BRICS as an institution and as an organization, not necessarily legitimizing Russia's actions in the Ukraine era, in Ukraine. But nonetheless, this BRICS summit itself, it underpins where the current consensus building is happening within the international system, including on peace and security issues, including on how to reform the international financial institutions and the UN organs themselves. And now how do we have Africa's voice now centralized in global dialogue? So that is what, and also the Global South's voice being central in multilateral platforms.
Well,
so BRICS itself in an is a very important institution, even though with domestic DA didn't find that very likable. But we have to push on and seeking the reforms that we need in the international system.
Lwazi, I know that there are plenty more aspects to unpack, but thank you for your time at this hour and for really summarizing and weighing in. I'm going to leave the conversation there for now. Lwazi Mbuyiseli, Senior Researcher, Southern African Liaison Office, chatting to us about the 16th BRICS Summit, of course, that wrapped in Kazan, Russia.